So this is it's more of an inspirational session, I think. So some of the sessions in the festival are about technique, like focusing that I was in a couple of hours ago. Some of them about areas of discussion and areas you can apply the middle way, like Christianity or feminism, for example. But certainly for me, and I hope maybe for you, Jung's Red Book is a source of inspiration for the middle way. So I'm going to talk about Jung's Red Book and how I find the middle way in it. There'll be some degree of storytelling involved from the Red Book. Perhaps just to get a quick idea, actually, again, using your yes/no signals. How many of you have read the Red Book? So yes if you've read it, no if you haven't. Let's see if anyone's got any experience of it. There are lots of no's. One or two yeses. Okay. That's brilliant. I mean, of course, there's a question of what one means by read. So certainly I think there'll probably be more people who've picked it up and looked at the pictures and thought, wow, and then put it down again. Maybe there are other people in that category. But yes, so I'll certainly assume that you're not acquainted with it at all. But I hope by the end to persuade you to have a look at it, really, because it's well worth, well, not just picking up and looking at the pictures and going, wow, but also reading properly. So I've got a PowerPoint I'm going to share with you, which I hope you can see. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to talk first of all about, well, why I'm interested in the Red Book, and a little bit about the background, so you understand where it's coming from, if you're not at all familiar with it, why it's of interest, and then I'm going to investigate at least one, possibly a couple of key sort of archetypal stories in it, and interpret them a little bit, which will give you a taste of it and why it's of interest. So, and I mean, if questions occur to you as we go along, then please do write them in the text or the chat box, and we can discuss those towards the end. Okay, so the yeah, why was I interested in Jung in the first place? Might be a good place to start. So I've been interested in Jung and archetypes for a long time. I think probably going back 30 years or something. I've been sort of dipping into Jung. And as I was developing writing about the middle way, I think it's formed quite an integral part of it because for me particularly, Jung provides ways of avoiding absolutization, particularly in the field of religion and the arts, by appreciating the meaning of religion without necessarily having to have absolute beliefs associated with it. So drawing on religious traditions for inspiration, in other words. So that's very much how I understand archetypes and their significance. And I talk more about that in the Christian Middle Way session for those of you who were there. So, yeah, I've a long-standing interest, but however, it was only about 5 years ago, I think, when I picked up the Red Book. Yeah, the Red Book was only published in 2009, so it hasn't been around that long. When I started to read it, I had this sort of wow moment. This is an incredible text. And the other thing I noticed fairly rapidly was that it seemed to be about the middle way. And maybe obviously there's a lot of confirmation bias, you could say, in that I was looking for it. It's an interest of mine. But nevertheless, it struck me that nobody else seemed to have noticed it. So that's why I ended up, after quite a few close readings of the text, writing a book about it, which, so that book is called Red Book, Middle Way, is the main title, and the subtitle is How Jung Parallels the Buddha's Method, the Human Integration. So that book will be coming out in October of this year with Equinox, the academic publisher. So I'm just in the process of checking some of the copy editing and so on for that. So it's in process, and it will have some nice pictures as well from the Red Book in it. So obviously what I'm going to say will in some ways give you a taste of that book, and you can always follow up the kind of approach I take to it by reading the book when it comes out. Okay, so that's a little bit about me and how I got into this. Now, much more about Jung. Jung, as you may know, was born in the late 19th century. He lived on into the 1960s. But the Red Book was the product of his sort of early middle age, and particularly the period around 1913 to 1914, so just before the First World War broke out. And there were just occasional shadows of that. He doesn't talk about external events directly, but you certainly get impressions of the rumblings of the First World War in the background from time to time. The Red Book was the product of what you might call kind of induced visions on Jung's part. So he used a technique which he called active imagination, which, as far as I can gather, really involves a process of relaxation and then allowing his imagination to work to develop a fantasy and see what happens. So he was awake, although he did use dreams as well, actually, in the Red Book. But I think most of the material he drew on was waking fantasy that was kind of deliberately induced and allowed to occur. And then, of course, the material is partly that, it's sort of what happened to him in his fantasies, but it's also his interpretations and his reflections on those visions, we might call them. The most intense period of those visions happened during the period September 1913 to April 1914, but they did carry on sporadically right up into the 1920s, I think. And first of all, he wrote down his notes and reflections on those visions in what are called the Black Books, and I believe that for those who are really into Jungiana, the Black Books are about to be published in their turn. So the Black Books were the kind of source for the Red Book. But what he then did was to take stuff out of the Black Books, his record of his visions and reflections, and write them up in the Red Book. And he did this in quite a special way. So he wanted it to be like a medieval manuscript. So he wrote it in calligraphic Gothic script, which makes it quite difficult to read, even if you know some German. It's quite difficult to make it out unless you're used to Gothic script, which I'm not really. And he did it in a medieval manuscript style. And to start with, he even used medieval page numbering. And of course, he also included pictures, and the pictures have also become very famous. So let me show you on the PowerPoint. Oops, not too far there. Yeah, let me show you on the PowerPoint just an example of a page from the Red Book, a fairly typical page. So it probably won't be detailed enough for you to see the writing, but it is in Gothic scripts. It's sort of very carefully, beautifully written. And there's a picture. So the pictures are interspersed with the pages. Occasionally the pictures illustrate what's going on in the text, but At other times, they don't really have any direct connection with it. They're just a general, well, I suppose an overall connection, obviously, because it's part of what's going on for Jung, but it's not specifically an illustration of the events in the text. And you find, well, a remarkable style, I think. So I think Jung was a very talented artist in addition to his other skills, and you can see that in his pictures. But there's a great deal of symbolism, which one can spend a good deal of time unpacking and discussing. Again, I won't be going into a lot of the detail of that, but there will be some in the book. So when he wrote his Red Book, it was not written for publication. It was written for his own satisfaction, maybe for immediate friends. So it was never adapted for an audience. If you write a book these days and you want it to get published, then you have to write it for an audience of some kind. And I think that's a great advantage, actually, that he never compromised it so as to be able to sell a book. It's just in some ways raw his experiences. And he didn't want it to be published because he thought it would be misunderstood. And he was trying to build a more scientific reputation, and he thought that if people read the Red Book during his lifetime, then they'd just think he was mad. So he never published it. But finally, in 2009, so around about 50 years after his death, the Jung family agreed to its publication. And it was then published by Norton. So you can now get it in two kinds of editions. So there's a very large book, which maybe I can show you. I'll have to stop sharing my PowerPoint for a moment, won't I? You can see me better. So this is what it looks like. It's a huge book, costs over £100, but if you can afford it, and in the long run, it's worth it if you are fascinated by the pictures, because it gives you a full version of the pictures. There is a cheaper version. There's the Reader's Edition, which doesn't have the pictures in, but it has all the text. And the text is actually the best place to start, I think, really engaging with the text. Okay, go back to my PowerPoint. Yeah, so the Red Book is, well, the text of the Red Book really records kind of personal integration process. So the process, I think, that Jung went through in the long term of overcoming conflicts within himself, encountering different aspects of his own psyche, and reconciling them. So he encounters different aspects of himself in the form of archetypal figures in his visions. Yeah, that's obviously one major reason why the Red Book can be such an inspiration. So you see one person's integration process almost wrestled through with all these figures, and that can be an inspiration for us to follow a similar process. Whether you can do it with the sort of internal imaginative intensity of Jung, of course, is a big question. But if you don't do that, it can also be an inspiration for our external lives as well, I think. So all the issues that come up with his internal figures are also issues that we find with actual external people. Yeah, Jung has to find the middle way constantly in his experiences, in the way that he reacts to the figures he meets. So he meets these people which are, well, they seem like people, like external persons, and he, particularly at the beginning of it, he wrestles with the question of, are these figures real? And he gets quite hung up on this, I think. Are they real or are they not real? if they're real, then he should treat them like an external person with the conventions that he would apply, obviously, to a real person. Or are they unreal? Eventually, he relaxes around that, I think, and works with it, and so that's again part of what's so revealing about it. And the figures then also tell him things, but the things are not always right. And that's another interesting aspect of it. So if you were dealing with a kind of traditional interpretation anyway of a religious scripture, which the Red Book much resembles in many ways, people might interpret it as revelation. This revelation gives you the truth from your unconscious, but it's not really like that. He gets different versions of what people think the truth is, and he has to work it out, just like he would with a real person, as it were, in your external experience. So, yeah, he has to get to grips with the fact that they're neither real nor unreal. So they're different aspects of his experience, and some of what they say is helpful and some of it isn't so helpful. All of it tells him something, right? Okay, so he has to find the middle way constantly. And as I've mentioned, the middle way is mentioned at various points in the text. Just go back to, this quote is the one I've put as the epigraph of the book that will come out in October, which I think is perhaps one of the best statements of the middle way in the Red Book. So the God calls me towards the right and the left, his voice calling out to me from both sides. Yet the God wants neither the one nor the other. He wants the middle way, but the middle is the beginning of the long road. So note the before God. Yeah. So the God he recognizes all the time as part of what's meaningful to him as an internal figure. He's not supernaturalizing God, but he is nevertheless treating him very seriously. So God for him is, I think, a symbol or an archetype of integration, of where he's going, if you want. So the possibility of integration, this vast potential that he glimpses ahead, as you like, involves the middle way. For him, it involves recognizing extremes that he has to try not to fall into and sort of head in between them somewhere. But as he says, it's the beginning of the long road. So, each middle way judgment that you make just might get you a little bit further, but you've still got another one ahead of you, and so on. It's just the beginning. So, the figures that Jung meets and needs to practice the middle way in relation to are archetypal figures, and you can roughly classify those figures, I think, into 4 archetypal forms. So those forms fulfill different functions to him. So each of those forms has a sort of similar function. So the first of these is what Jung often calls in the Red Book God, or later on he called it the self with a capital S. So again, the self was the potentially integrated psyche, the whole of what he could be, if you like. And then the wise old man, who is a figure who obviously embodies that set of possibilities. So if you meet somebody who seems to be wiser than you, then they may embody for you qualities that you yourself might develop. So figures that Jung meets like this, Izdubar is the first one. I will talk more about Izdubar in a minute. And Elijah, so it's a version of the Old Testament prophet Elijah he meets. And Philemon is another big figure in the Red Book. Loosely based on a classical figure, but again, he becomes a specific figure in Jung's sort of personal mythology. So there's the godlike archetype, and then there's the shadow archetype. So Jung meets demons. He has kinds of hellish visions, rather sort of Dantean visions. And then he meets this kind of wily, urbane devil called the Red One, and has sort of horrible, prickly arguments with him, like you might have on the internet with somebody who misunderstands you, that sort of argument. And then there's a tramp he meets. Well, I'm not sure if tramp is the right word, but a homeless, destitute person, let's say, who he meets, and he recognises again the shadow of his fear of poverty and destitution and what that person represents. So the shadow comes across in various ways, and it's encountered in various ways. And then there's the anima. So Jung, being a middle-aged man, is kind of compensating qualities, positive qualities, are very likely to take a largely feminine form, which Jung called the anima. The equivalent for a woman he called the animus, a masculine kind of archetypal form. So this appears, well, particularly in the figure of Salome, who I'm going to talk about a bit later. So again, a figure from the Bible. The anima also appears as the soul, which can take the form of a serpent or a bird. And he finds a hidden daughter in a castle. He encounters a maiden being tortured by a demon. He finds an intuitive female cook. So there are these different female figures who have similar kinds of compensatory functions for him. And then there's a little bit about the hero, not so much in the Red Book, but the fourth type of figure is the hero, who is encountered at one point as a kind of Siegfried-like figure, so a bit like somebody out of Wagner, with his horn and his riding on his horse with his sword and so on. So there are those archetypal figures. There are also reflections on death, a lot in the book, and the dead. So he encounters the dead, and but what he means by the dead doesn't actually seem to be literal death as we would normally think of it. So it's more like, well, those of you who've been to the Gilchrist sessions of this festival will know what I mean if I talk about heavy left hemisphere dominance. So people who are very kind of literalistic and maybe obsessive and maybe full of anxiety, but got very rigid understanding of the world and their lives. The dead seem to have that kind of, to represent that kind of state of mind amongst the living. And he also explores language and its meaning quite a lot, again, in figures that he meets. So there's this hermit figure called Ammonius, and he has long debates about meaning with Ammonius, meaning of language. And there's also a scholar and a librarian who he discusses language with. So there are these various themes that run through the Red Book, all of which are part of Jung's kind of investigation. Some of it's an intellectual investigation as well as a kind of wrestling with his own aspects of his own potentiality. Okay, so to illustrate that a bit more fully and specifically, I want to go into one of the stories in a bit more detail. So, so this is the story of Izdubar, which I think is one of the most striking stories in the Red Book. Very, very rich story. And I think it's a story which for me is all about the middle way. And it's also about how we deal with God and all the stuff around God in Western civilization. So, I'll read you the text, but it's also on the slide there, so you can refer to it. This is, of course, you have to remember, is a translation, but it's a pretty good translation of the German. So he's kind of in a mountain. He's in a wilderness kind of area, climbing a mountain. In his vision, as I approach the top, a mighty booming resounds from the other side of the mountain. like ore being pounded. The sound gradually swells and echoes thunderously in the mountain. As I reach the pass, I see an enormous man approach from the other side. 2 bull horns rise from his great head, and a rattling suit of armour covers his chest. His black beard is ruffled and decked with exquisite stones. The giant is carrying a sparkling double axe in his hand, like those used to strike bulls. Before I can recover from my amazed fright, the giant is standing before me. I look at his face. It is pale, faint and pale and deeply wrinkled. His almond-shaped eyes look at me astonished. Horror takes hold of me. This is Izdubar, the mighty bullman. He stands and looks at me. His face speaks of consuming inner fear, and his hands and knees tremble. Izdubar, the powerful bull, trembling? Is he frightened? Okay, so the situation here is that Jung, well, he's approaching these mountains from the west. This has significance. He ascends and he meets Izdubar coming from the east. And as you see, Izdubar seems like this sort of terrifying pagan figure. I suppose what he reminds me of most is kind of Mesopotamian figures, you know, carved in stone in the British Museum or something like that. But he also has an illustration of Izdubar in his inimitable style. But yeah, again, there's a kind of mythic distancing there. Yeah, so it's not just a realist picture; it's a mythic picture. And there, I take it, is Jung at the bottom there, that tiny figure, feeling the terror of Izdubar. So that's the immediate, moment where he encounters Izdubar, which is like kind of meeting God, and later Izdubar basically becomes God. So it's terrifying. But the other strange thing that happens, as you've just seen in the extract, is that actually Izdubar is frightened of Jung, and and now we have to remember that Izdubar is part of Jung as well. So it's not surprising if the roles get reversed. And the West that Jung is talking about represents the West, perhaps in the way that we normally use the word with a capital W. That is sort of developed and particularly scientifically influenced civilization. And what happens when Jung meets Izdubar then is he starts telling him about the scientific view of things. And he tells him that the sun lies in empty space. And this suddenly seems to have a very negative effect on Izdubar. So Izdubar describes this as poison. So he's encountered the scientific worldview and he's suddenly stricken by it and suddenly diminished. So Jung is then left on this mountainside with this stricken God who's suddenly lost his power because he's unpreparedly met scientific civilization. So obviously you could compare that to maybe a deeply believing naive Christian sort of listens to a lecture by Richard Dawkins and suddenly realize, oh, this was all a delusion. So that's the poison, if you like. That's the basis of this sense of meaning has disappeared. So Jung is stranded with this stricken God and doesn't know what to do. Now, the next thing he does, quite interestingly, is build a fire. And this is where there's another reference to the middle way. So they're sitting by the fire trying to warm themselves, him and this God. The high blazing flame is the middle way, he says, whose luminous course runs between the human and the divine. So it's almost like the fire is a way of dealing with the situation. It's the middle way because it's not a total solution, but it's a helpful thing to do in the circumstances, given everybody's needs, at that point. So it becomes symbolically important. So Jung gradually begins to realise there's no easy way. He can't just bring back his Debar to his previous glory. But Jung comes up with a makeshift kind of consolation. So he starts to try and help his Debar, who he loves and is concerned about. So he suggests that the scientific view refers to outer things, and the mythic view refers to inner things. So that sounds a bit to me like some solutions that some people have suggested to conflicts between science and religion. So for example, Stephen Jay Gould, who's talking about non-overlapping magisteria. So the idea that science and religion are talking about different things. However, that seems to be just an abstract solution, really. It doesn't actually address the situation they're in. So that kind of gets left aside. And in the morning, Jung wakes up and he's faced with the same problem. So he's got his Debar is stricken and he doesn't know what to do. So here's an extract from that point. So I paced the mountain ridge, pondering, and looked back to my western lands, where there is so much knowledge and so much possibility of help. I love his Debar, and I do want him to wither away miserably. But where should help come from? No one will travel the hot, cold path. And I am afraid to return to that path. And in the east, was there possibly help there? But what about the unknown dangers that loomed there? I do not want to go blind. What use would that be to his Debar? Okay, so there's various symbolisms here. So the hot, cold path is part of the way that Jung has come up the mountain from the west. It's a bizarre path that's got two strands to it that are hot and cold. And that seems to represent dualism, really, so extremes of view in contrast to each other in the Western view of things. And the East is the traditional world, the world where people believe in God and so on. And Jung realizes he can't just go there for help. Maybe we could compare, going into the East as a kind of fundamentalist solution. So you try and embrace the traditional worldview, but actually you're in the modern world. So it's you end up being blinded, which is obviously a symbol of delusion. So the way back to the West involves the hot and cold path, involves dealing with the dualisms, the problem of does God exist or doesn't he? So after further pondering, Jung hits on a solution. But at first he expresses this rather clumsily to his Debar. So first he says, I think you're not at all real, but only a fantasy. His Debar doesn't like that. But then he hits on a better way of putting it, so that his Debar is eventually persuaded to find it more acceptable. And I'll show you that quote. So, I don't mean to say that you are not real at all, of course, but only as real as a fantasy. If you would accept this, much would be gained. You know that the name one bears means a lot. You also know that one often gives the sick new names to heal them. So this is, I think, one of the most interesting points. So he's recognizing that actually he has the power, and he can change the meaning of his Debar. It's not just something that's given to him from somewhere else. He can maintain his Debar's power in some ways, whilst changing how he regards him and interprets him. And so, yeah, I mean, this idea of degrees of realness is a bit problematic, but I think what that stands for really is the power to reframe things and to reframe their significance. So the amazing thing then is Izdubar agrees, okay, you know, I'll think of myself as only as real as a fantasy. So at that point, Jung is able to pick Izdubar up, this massive God-man with his axe and so on. So now as light as a feather. So Jung picks him up and he carries him back home to the West. So that seems like a good solution in some ways. If, you know, if we can sort of treat God as light as a feather instead of weighing us down, then maybe that's the solution to the conflicts people feel about it. Then there's one final problem. So when Jung gets home, Izdubar is still, though he's very light, he's way too big. So he can't get Izdubar through the door. But he finds another solution. Realizing that he's infinitely flexible, he scrunches him up small, he scrunches him to the size of an egg and puts him in his pocket. So in that way, he's able to even bring Izdubar into his house. Basically what's happening here, and thinking what makes this so fascinating, is that Jung is moving in a world of meaning, you know, rather than beliefs about things, beliefs about the world. So it's a world of meaning in order to develop practical resolutions to conflicts that could not have been resolved at the belief level. You know, if he'd just done theology, he'd just have got stuck. But he tackles it in a different way. If you just tackle it at the belief level, the framing assumptions are likely to stay fixed unless you go through quite a rigorous process of questioning, philosophical questioning, and introduce new models and so on, which can be very difficult for a lot of people. Yeah, so in this case, the framing assumptions about God will be his absolute, so he can't be made to fit human needs. But giving up God, you know, if it would leave us lacking archetypal resources. So Jung really feels that he'd be losing something. You know, if he just abandoned Izdubar on the mountainside, he'd lose an important link to his experiences of greater potential that inspire him. And that rather links to what Jung says about Christianity at various points. So at one point he says about Christianity, you can certainly leave Christianity, but it does not leave you. So obviously that only applies to people, I think, who have a Christian background, but it implies you've got to get to grips with it in some way rather than just denying it. So Jung basically adopts a pragmatic framework for preserving the archetypal God. Okay, and there's a kind of coda to this story, which I'll just mention. I won't go on too much longer, but so when Jung gets home with Izdubar packaged in his egg, he begins to worry about the loss of power. So how can this really be God in this egg if he's not powerful? How can God be meaningful without power? And you can link that to the idea that awe and terror are part of our experience of God. You know, so the Israelites on Mount Sinai, for example, found Mount Sinai to be dangerous because God was there. And Jung also wants to be able to blaspheme God. He doesn't feel it's really God if he can't blaspheme it, you know, and feel there's a problem with doing so. He can't blaspheme an egg. So he wants God back in a way. So he does incantations over the egg. And then Izdubar bursts out of the egg. And he provides a picture of this, although he relates it to a Sanskrit text, but it's basically, I think, an illustration of something, unusually in the Red Book. It's an illustration of something that happens in the text, more or less. So you've got this tiny egg and this enormous, you could call it an explosion out of the egg. So Izdubar bursts out. And then Jung says, "Oh, Izdubar, divine one, how wonderful, you are healed." And Izdubar replies, "Healed? Was I ever sick? Who speaks of sickness? I was son, completely son. I am the sun. So the meaning of Izdubar hasn't changed. So he's just as powerful, it seems, in the ways that matter, even though he's packed in the egg. And then he's just as happy to be out of the egg, of course. That doesn't resolve all Jung's problems. He carries on wrestling with these issues, but that's I think a very interesting engagement with the problems associated with beliefs about God and like the archetype of God. Okay, so I won't go on to some other things I could talk about, but I was going to talk about the Anima figures in the Red Book a bit, but I think I'd be going on for too long if I did. But I think one good story is probably the best way of giving you a fuller impression of why the Red Book is so fascinating. So it's just a small indication of the rich symbolic content, which is not all about God. Some of it's also about, let's say, feminine figures, about language, about the hero, and about the shadow, and how it stimulates thought on the middle way. But obviously that's my take on it. And the best thing also is for you to read the Red Book, reflect on it, and reach your own impressions of what it means to you. But if you are interested in a middle way interpretation of it, then obviously my book should help to stimulate reflection on the middle way as it emerges in Jung's practical process of navigation throughout most of the book. Okay, so I'm going to stop there, but I stop sharing that PowerPoint and come back to perhaps the best thing is if I see nobody's written any questions as yet, but if there's anything you'd like to either comment really or ask, then do, if you could raise a virtual hand or a yes signal, anything that's handy in the participants box you'll find at the bottom. The virtual hand is maybe under the more section, the 3 dots, and then you click it and you see it. Any kind of signal, and if you'd like to say something. Okay, Miranda, would you like to unmute yourself? What would you like to say, Miranda?
Oh yeah, can you hear?
Yeah.
Hello, thank you very much for your talk. I was just wondering if you could comment a bit more about gender, because that was one of the topics you didn't have time for. There is obviously quite a bit of work on Jung and feminism. It's been quite controversial. And there are some feminist interpretations, but some feminists perceive that that he essentializes women's identity too much. Obviously, he's writing in a particular context. Yeah. And I was just wondering if you can perhaps talk a bit more about the representation of women, and also, do you have any thoughts about comparable processes of integration that you've come across that do involve women, or how you think it might be different? Thank you.
Okay. Well, my take on this, which is elaborated in my forthcoming book, is that I think you're right, or I think the feminist critics are right here in that Jung does tend to essentialize gender, and his account of the anima and the animus. Well, one of the obvious things wrong with it from a modern point of view is that he tends to assume that certain things are always true for women and certain things are always true for men. So he turns an incremental scale or spectrum of kind of qualities that are more or less associated with the different sexes, masculinity or femininity, and turns it into a duality in some ways. So obviously, any people in the LGBTQ community will probably want to question that particularly. The way I would prefer to interpret the anima stroke animus is as an engagement with the other, with the attractive other. So if you describe it in that way, then it applies to everybody. equally well, but it will take different forms according to what you find attractively other. So obviously for a traditional heterosexual man like Jung, the anima represents, takes a very feminine form, and it represents this attractive otherness, which is, it's not like him, it's things, potential qualities of him. And he does talk in the Red Book about other ways apart from sex in which the anima is different from him. So how for example, if you are old, then your anima or animus will be young, not young actually, young. And if you're highly educated and sophisticated, then your anima animus may be naive and simplistic. So it'll be compensatory in some sense, but there'll be something attractive about that compensation. And I think also the anima animus can take impersonal forms. So things like an alluring landscape, I think, can be symbols of the anima. So that's a particular suggested interpretation for practical purposes, really. And I think you could, as with a lot of Jung, I find that the Red Book is more helpful practically than other things in Jung, generally speaking, because it's kind of closer to the heart of where Jung was coming from when he was at his most exploratory and flexible, and before he kind of formalized it more fully. So there are a lot of insights and ideas there, which are not, they're not turned too much into dogmas or, so a lot of the ways that Jungians often interpret what he said, particularly about the anima and animus, for example, are based on stronger, kind of slightly more dogmatic formulations he made later on. Okay, so as with all of this, that's my suggestion for how one could work with it and be inspired by it in a way that's more adequate to the complexities of gender and sex.
Thank you, that's very helpful.
Great. Any other questions anyone else would like to signal? Hannah, is that as a hand to come in, Hannah?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I'm fascinated by Jung, and I have how to put it. I have had. It's interesting hearing about the Red Book. I think I'll definitely be reading that, because I think Jung's experience in the Red Book is something that I have personal experience of, a similar journey through visualization meditation practices. So, which was very interesting, because that happened before then reading any Jung. I didn't know anything about him, and then I went back and started reading about Jungian archetypes and was like, oh right, okay. So it's interesting what you say about this is a more personal, this is the start and this is a more personal journey, because the issues that I had was then him trying to overgeneralize, saying this is how it is for all all people, human beings, this is how archetypes will present themselves. And I think, rather than this being his own personal spiritual journey, and how that manifested for him. So I think actually this is going to be really fascinating for me to have a look into. I'd also say coming across other people who've been practicing, I would say, middle way paths and approaches in their own life, many of them, especially people I've come across like myself, who have started off being very left brain dominant, have found developing a personal relationship with an archetype to be an extremely powerful practice to counteract that and to move into a more right brain area in a way that's accessible. And I would highly recommend that to anyone who wants to explore that, because it doesn't really matter what the archetype is, as long as it's something that resonates for you as an individual. So I just wondered if you had any experience of that in your own practice.
Yes, I mean, I did go through a phase of attempting to be a Buddhist, well, being a Buddhist and trying visualization practices and so on. I wouldn't say at that point, perhaps I wasn't ready for them, or I didn't get on with them hugely. But what I found more helpful for me was, trying his process of active imagination and seeing what comes up. It's actually a bit more related to focusing that we had in the earlier session, but with a kind of more Jungian touch. So you could develop a focusing kind of process, feeling what's going on in you, if you like, or felt sense, as they call it in focusing, and then seeing if that could turn into something more substantial, like a figure or an image or something of that kind. And that's often a good way of getting a sense of what's going on for you.
Yeah, I think, because the other thing is, I think it's been established scientifically that there's a spectrum regarding people's ability to internally visualize, which I was never aware of, because what they find interesting is people who, wherever they are on that spectrum, tend to think that everyone else is on the same place in that spectrum. And there's been some, so for instance, I've had a friend who I found out, I've known them for 10 years and found out they weren't able to visualize anything whatsoever internally, visually, and I had known this person for 10 years and I had no idea that was. And then when I started talking about my experience, they were just sort of wide-eyed and so, because I'm very far down the other end of the spectrum. So I think you know, the approach they will take will obviously be based on what they can actually achieve, basically.
Indeed. Great. Okay, well, thanks very much for that. We've probably just got time for one more question, because I'm going to need to stop on time, because we've got the concluding words following immediately after this session. But Vijaya, I think you have a question.
Hi. Yes, you've kind of been addressing it. You might have seen the text. It was about your take on archetypes. I hear you mention your interest in them here and there. Are you strictly speaking about Jungian archetypes, or can you expand more generally on why they're important to you and how you practice with them, although you have been just talking about that?
Yeah, okay. Well, I suppose it is Jungian in the sense that Jung is the source on archetypes. But I do feel that Jung needs some development and interpretation on archetypes. And I like to interpret the idea of the archetype in a very functional way. So rather than worrying about this question that worries some people, do archetypes exist? Which seems to me a non-question, really. The question is, do we experience things which we can helpfully call archetypes? That's so if we put aside questions like, is there a collective unconscious, or what on earth does that mean, and exact nature of what archetypes are, and focus on what they do, then I think you can very helpfully think of archetypes as functions. And I think of them as functions that continue to inspire us over a period of time. That's why they have such a key role in religions, because people need reminding of their ideals, or they need reminding of ways that they could be bigger than they think they are, basically, in different respects. So the ways you could practice with archetypes are manifold. So as Hannah just talked about, you could have a complex Buddhist visualization practice, and if that works for you, then that's great. For me, that's a bit too culturally specific, but it's just having a picture on your wall which inspires you and reminds you of the importance of an archetype could be a big thing. If you look at that picture every day and it means something to you, and then it can make a difference.
So then they're not just abstract symbols, they're identities, are they? They're kind of figures that you maintain in your mind as meaning this or that.
Yeah, they're functions. So yeah, they are definitely distinct from particular symbols, because they will take a different form according to the culture and indeed according to the individual. But the similarity between them is the function that they have for humans in general. So I think that particularly the 4 archetypes I talked about briefly, so God or the self, the anima animus, the shadow, and the hero, can be identified very, very widely in different cultures and different places. And Jung did a lot of work on that, obviously, on those patterns across cultures.
Yeah.
afraid I'm going to have to bring things to a close. Just
okay, thank you.
Because I'm running the next session, which is kind of in 2 minutes. So thanks to everyone for coming along, and thank you very much for the questions and contributions. And I hope you'll have a look at the Red Book if you've never done so before. I kind of recommend it. And of course, buy my book when it comes out in October. Little plug. Okay, so see you hopefully if you just click the link for concluding words, then I can see you in a minute, which will just be 15 or 20 minutes to just round off the festival in what I hope is a satisfactory way. Okay, so I'm going to stop now. Thank you.
Thank you.